Now that we've established that disagreeing with black people isn't racist, we must address the question. Is it racist to tell a black person who they should vote for? This is an argument I've heard from a lot of black conservatives. Telling a black person whom they should vote for is racist. More specifically, telling a black person who they should vote for on the basis of them being black is racist. According to them, you're stereotyping black people into a singular political identity.
You're attacked also, in many respects, because of your race, because you're not supposed to think like this and talk like this. A lot of white liberals just don't like it, do they?
Well, they're the most racist people there are because, they put you in a little category, a little box. You have to think this way. How could you dare come off the plantation?
Isn't it interesting, Aaron? I think even Mary would agree with me that it is quite racist to say that all certain type of people look alike, but somehow with many white liberals, and for that matter, black liberals, it is not racist to have the presumption that all blacks do or all blacks should think alike. And that's what Dr. Carson was talking about, and he's dead on.
To them, this is wrong because black conservatives or black Republicans do exist, and black people can be those things. But we already know this. Most leftists and progressives know that black right-wingers exist, but for some reason, a lot of black conservatives still act like their existence is shocking to the left. Even though they've been featured in the mainstream media plenty of times, and there are plenty of incredibly famous black conservative pop culture figures. Most people know that black people can be conservative. The question is just, should they be? As a leftist, you can probably imagine my answer. No, they shouldn't. And in a way, I do understand why that may sound racist to some people. But let me clarify by saying that I don't think anybody should be conservative. Just like I don't think anybody should vote Republican. Now, to some people that might sound very polarizing. And while I do try to stay away from polarizing language to the best of my abilities, at the end of the day, I'm still a progressive leftist. And this doesn't mean that I'm against every type of conservative. First of all, let me just say that I'm not trying to condemn conservative individuals, but rather the ideology of conservatism. See, I'm okay with conservatism to a reasonable extent. Conservative gender roles are fine as long as they're between two consenting adults. Traditional marriage is fine as long as you don't want that to be the only type of marriage. And Christianity is fine as long as you're not condemning any individuals. Basically, I'm fine with conservatism as long as it's just a personal thing. But once it starts affecting other people, specifically people that have been marginalized by conservatism, that's when I have a problem with it. So there it is. I'm against conservatism of all races, not just black ones. Although, I'm not against them equally though. Allow me to elaborate. There's something especially bad about being a black conservative or black Republican, and that is the fact that you're operating against your own interests. And therefore, it makes less sense to be a black conservative than a white conservative. And to those who still think that's racist, let me ask you a question. Does it make equally as much sense for a black person to be a white nationalist as for a white person to be a white nationalist? No, of course not. Being a black-white nationalist is different than being a white-white nationalist. One is advocating for something that will result in them being deported or maybe even killed, and the other is not. Now, being a white nationalist obviously isn't the same thing as being a conservative. I recognize that there's a huge difference in levels of egregiousness. Being a conservative is obviously not nearly as egregious as being a white nationalist. But it still illustrates the point that being a black conservative is different than being a white conservative, as it results in different outcomes for the two. And that is because of the circumstances of the current state of America. I will admit that yes, if you remove the fact that America and many other Western countries have been built on the oppression of black people, being a white conservative and being a black conservative would be the same, since they would most likely be trying to conserve the same thing. However, because of that history of systemic oppression that doesn't just get completely erased without leaving any tracks, Black people and white people have a different socioeconomic status in the US. Republican policies just affect black people negatively since they don't want to fix the problem of systemic racism, and often want to set in place policies that make the problem worse, and that's why black people should not be conservative. Now, I recognize that there might be some black people that don't accept this premise, because they don't believe that systemic racism exists, or that black people are oppressed, and that's fine. I mean, no, it's not fine, but I'm not gonna try to prove the existence of systemic racism, because that's not what this video is about. There are already plenty of people who've done a much better job at that than me. This video is about who the real racists are. But if that's really what you think, I think that the conversation should be about that. Not about if telling a black person who to vote for is racist. Another big part of this is contrarianism. Or rather, not wanting to be told what to do or what is expected of you, and then doing the opposite in response. A lot of this stems from something that black conservatives call the Democratic plantation. A sort of conspiracy theory that arose from a quote from once Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson that goes as follows: "I'll have them voting Democrat for 200 years.
I'll have them voting Democrat for 200 years. So now, the Democratic Party prospers on the votes of the very people it has spent much of its history oppressing. Democrats falsely claim that the Republican Party is the villain, when in reality, it's the failed policies of the Democratic Party that have kept blacks down. Massive government welfare has decimated the black family. Opposition to school choice has kept them trapped in failing schools. Politically correct policing has left black neighborhoods defenseless against violent crime. So when you think about racial equality and civil rights, which political party should come to mind?"
This part of the video is insane. She packs so much nonsense into the last minute that I could make an entire video about it. First of all, that quote from LBJ is so poorly substantiated that no serious person should ever use it. Nobody claimed that he said it until 1995, which was 31 years after he signed the Civil Rights Act and 22 years after his death. And by the way, even if he really did say that about signing the Civil Rights Act, he still signed the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was so crucial to the history of civil rights and racial justice that you just tried to give the Republican Party credit for it. How on earth do you go from bragging that technically more Republicans voted for it than Democrats to saying that it's part of the Democrats' nefarious conspiracy to, quote, keep blacks down? It goes without saying that I strongly disagree with her opinions on assistance programs, school choice, and criminal justice, but even if I agreed with her that Democratic policies have been keeping black people down, that wasn't the intent of the policies. She says, quote, "When all of their efforts to enslave blacks, keep them enslaved, and keep them from voting had failed, the Democrats came up with a new strategy. If black people are going to vote, they might as well vote for Democrats." Who came up with this strategy, and how did they secretly get the other Democrats on board with the conspiracy? And how deep does the conspiracy go? How did they get civil rights activists in on the conspiracy? Was Obama in on the conspiracy? Are the dozens of black Democrats serving in the House and Senate in on the conspiracy? Are we in on the conspiracy? And most importantly, are black voters in on the conspiracy? This conspiracy theory relies on the idea that Democrats, who are secretly white supremacists, have been tricking black people to overwhelmingly vote for them for generations without catching on. As for the conspiracy itself, that would be, by far, the dumbest political strategy in American history. By far. Democrats lost the South, the base of their support, forever. The New Deal coalition collapsed, and they lost to Republicans again and again for decades. The strategy of trading in the votes of white conservatives for African Americans doesn't make sense numerically, and it's suicidal when you consider that because of the Electoral College, the votes of black people are often overruled entirely by the white people who surround them. And, as if this conspiracy theory to win over black voters wasn't absurd enough already, it completely disintegrates when you consider that black people were already voting for Democrats.
And the problem with this is that, if you really boil it down, this really is just normal American politics. Every party will tell you to vote for them. That isn't new. every political party, as society became more progressive, went from not wanting black people to be able to legally vote to wanting black people to vote for them, as they saw that restricting the ability to vote was a losing battle. And if the claim is that they're trying to get black people to vote for them especially, then I would say that that's a crazy idea, since during the time that Lyndon B. Johnson said the infamous quote, "Race relations weren't what they are now," and there was a lot more racial tension. So appealing to black voters would risk alienating a lot of white voters, and since back then white people made up the majority of the country and still do, doing that could have turned out to be a huge net loss if it turned out white people weren't as okay with black people's rights as the Dems maybe thought. And I understand that the Democratic Party has a tendency to pander to black people and say things that are racially insensitive, but that's still not a reason to vote Republican, since they literally do the same shit. So many black conservatives were outraged, triggered if you may, about Biden's "they're gonna put y'all back in chains" comments. But Trump pretty much does the same thing with his "what do you have to lose" speech, and that's just Trump being his edgy, abrasive self. But you know what? Here's something I'd like to say to black conservatives. If you really don't like people telling you who to vote for, I got just the guy for you.
Why should people who feel that they are better off today under the Trump administration vote for you?
Well, if they think that, they probably shouldn't. They think 54% of American people are better off economically today than they were in our administration. Well, their memory is not very good, quite frankly.
Now, I couldn't end this video without addressing the right's biggest, most prevalent argument for the Dems or the left or the progressives being the real racists. And that is bigotry of low expectations. And it's a topic that I've been avoiding throughout this video for the purpose of talking about it in the end, so I can fully address it. Bigotry of low expectations can be described as expecting less from members of a disadvantaged group and thus implicitly encouraging those people not to reach their full potential. The phrase "the soft bigotry of low expectations" was coined by President George W. Bush in 2000 in a speech to the NAACP that marked the launching of the No Child Left Behind Act. Bush asserted discrimination is still reality even when it takes different forms. Instead of Jim Crow, there's racial redlining and profiling. Instead of separate but equal, there's separate and forgotten. After promising that his administration would enforce civil rights, Bush announced that he would be confronting another form of bias, the soft bigotry of low expectations. He acknowledged that educational achievement gaps fall along socioeconomic and racial lines, but evaded discussing any systemic causes of these gaps. From then, it came to be used by many conservatives and right-wing outlets as an accusation against the progressive wing. Simply put, the accusation was that the progressive Democrats were the real racists because they wanted to treat black people like children. Now, not a lot of leftists actually have properly responded to this accusation of racism, so let me be the first one to do that. And I want to start out by saying that, in theory, this is a valid thing to criticize someone for. And as someone who is neurodivergent, I've experienced quite a lot of bigotry of low expectations throughout my life, mainly in education. And I can say that it has impacted my life in an incredibly negative way. But I will not let my anecdotal experience cloud my judgment. Because while I recognize that bigotry of low expectations is a bad thing, I don't think it's as bad as it's made out to be. And I take great issue with the way it's weaponized by the right. The way that bigotry of low expectations is often painted is as a misguided attempt at helping someone. This misguidedness would demonstrate itself in a person helping another person overcompensating in their help of that person, to an extent where it actually does more harm than good. So what this presents is a sort of spectrum of overcompensating in your help on one end and reducing it on the other. And the goal would be to find the balance in that spectrum. Now, applying that spectrum to the real world, I would say that progressives lean towards the overcompensation end of that spectrum, and conservatives towards the reduction end. Where on the far end of that spectrum you overcompensate in your attempt at solving the problem, that you completely overestimate the problem to the point of no recognition, and you actually end up harming the people that you're trying to help. It's hard to tell what exactly the outcome is of each end, since the thing about spectrums is that there's never a clear end. And on the other hand, I'd say that you reduce so much of your help toward that group that you're not helping them at all, and not even intending to. In fact, you're actively doing the opposite, where you're trying to sabotage them and treat them incredibly unfairly, making life as hard as possible for them, which could lead to them not being allowed to have a job or maybe even becoming slaves. Who knows how far any of these ends could go in the modern world. But when applying this to the real world and applying it to the situations of marginalized groups, one thing is for sure. We have not reached the balance. Because the balance is ultimately equality. And if we had full equality, then those groups wouldn't be marginalized, would they? I mean, if you look at the definition of bigotry of low expectations, you'll find that an accusation of it already kind of supports a progressive worldview. Expecting less from members of a disadvantaged group and thus implicitly encouraging those people not to reach their full potential, already implying that those groups are disadvantaged in society. If black people are disadvantaged in society, then that means that there is a system that is disadvantaging them, whatever that system may be. But conservatives still deny the existence of systemic racism. One of the main problems black conservatives have with progressives is that the progressive wing is condescending in its attempts to help black people. And in a way, that critique is valid.
Conservatives believe blacks and other minorities are every bit as capable as whites of succeeding as engineers, surgeons, policemen, businessmen, lawyers, and college students. And therefore, lowering standards for blacks is unnecessary as well as insulting. Yet for this belief, conservatives are called racist. The irony, of course, is that those who accuse conservatives of being racist believe blacks and other minorities are not as capable as whites of succeeding and therefore still need affirmative action, almost a half-century after it was first implemented. Let's look at another issue where this contrast between conservatives and those who accuse them of being racist is even more starkly drawn: voter ID. Conservatives say America should require every voter to present an ID when voting, just as European countries do to help keep their elections honest. Are all these democracies racist? Of course not. Yet the accusers say that conservatives who support voter ID are racist. Why do they say this? Because, they argue, it's really a ruse to prevent blacks and other minorities from voting, since many of them just aren't capable of acquiring an ID. Can you get more condescending than that?
It never feels good to be condescended. But it's when this critique is used to push back on real progressive policy that I start to have a problem. See, I'd say that this critique is best levied in interpersonal situations. But in situations like fixing hiring discrimination, this critique becomes reductive. And it's here that I see the extent of condescension being overstated to the point where it becomes harmful. One critique of affirmative action that is often levied by black conservatives is that affirmative action is condescending to black people, because it's treating them differently based on race, even if that gives them an advantage and not a disadvantage. And while I admit they do have a point, I never really took this as anything more than food for thought, a flaw of affirmative action, but not a reason why it shouldn't exist. The reason for that is that the alternative is way worse, because hiring discrimination does exist. And if you disagree, then once again, that's what you should be arguing against, not if trying to combat that discrimination is condescending. I think the average black person, if not just the average person in general, would probably agree not receiving a job based on your race is worse than receiving a job based on your qualifications mostly and slightly based on your race, as a way to level out the playing field. especially if you're extremely poor and barely able to provide for yourself or in some cases your family, and thus in extreme need of a job. In fact, in that scenario, saying that you're giving black people jobs based on their race would also be a huge oversimplification and misrepresentation. If anything, you're giving them a job based on the poor treatment of their race. And let me just say that as someone who has been victim of bigotry of low expectations, and has dealt with quite a lot of condescension myself, I would rather get a job because of my qualifications and slightly because of my neurodivergency than not receive a job at all because of my neurodivergency. Now I want to focus on the overcompensation aspect. Because while it is true that some progressives often overcompensate in their efforts to help marginalized groups, there are reasons for that. Let's bring things back to the spectrum of overcompensation and reduction. When we apply this to the problems of the modern world, finding the balance on that spectrum can be hard to do, because we're talking about people helping a marginalized group, when they themselves are not part of that group. You don't know what it's like to experience the oppression that that group is experiencing. Thereby, you can only really guess the severity of the problems they face. So, inevitably, as someone who is not a member of that group, you're going to get some things wrong. You either end up overstating their problems or undermining them. And maybe this is just me, but I feel like when you're trying to support a group that is suffering from a lot of pain that they experience as a result of their oppression, the last thing you want to do is undermine their problems. Because they are very serious problems. And overcompensating the severity of those problems is still way less bad than undermining them. From my perspective, it's always a better option to be charitable when listening to a marginalized group than uncharitable. Something that has always bothered me about the soft bigotry of low expectations argument is how much it gets overstated by the right. So let's talk about bigotry of low expectations and how bad it can really get. Because when the right talks about bigotry of low expectations, they're not talking about real bigotry of low expectations. They're talking about, well, soft bigotry of low expectations. The one that results in black conservatives feeling condescended or put on a pedestal, treated like children in a really indirect way. They're talking about bigotry of low expectations in as far as it supports their conservative agenda. But none of that is real bigotry of low expectations, though. Real bigotry of low expectations is forbidding women from getting a job or serving in the military because women are the weaker sex. Real bigotry of low expectations is sending gay people to conversion therapy because they're just broken, mentally ill people who can't think rationally and so don't know what is good for them. Real bigotry of low expectations is sterilizing a whole subgroup of people that consists out of millions out of a fear that they're gonna weaken the nation, and so on. It's not whatever black conservatives are trying to say it is. Or at least, if it is, then it's an incredibly watered-down, almost incomparable version of bigotry of low expectations. And all the examples of bigotry of low expectations that I just listed are all conservative examples of bigotry of low expectations. Because, believe it or not, conservatives are also more than capable of expressing bigotry of low expectations, even in the condescending form that they accuse the left of. And this is illustrated, ironically enough, in the conservative/Republican accusation against the Democrats of bigotry of low expectations. They talk about black Democratic voters being brainwashed or not thinking for themselves, and a lot of other stuff that would fall under the label of bigotry of low expectations. Because you don't have to be a very observant person to notice that the way some of these conservatives and Republicans, many of whom are black by the way, talk about black Democrats sounds pretty condescending.
You see, the problem is that African Americans have not yet developed an apparatus to make Democrats make good on their promises once they are in the office. So instead, what do? We complain about it for 4 years and then we get right back on the wheel. We are literally like hamsters on a wheel. Run, 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 run. That's funny. I thought I was going places. Run, 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 run. So weird. Run, 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 run. I don't understand. Stop the madness. Literal hamster mentality is what African Americans are suffering from each and every time they invest in a Democratic candidate. Our current president has been accused of being a lot of things, anti-Semitic among them. Don't you find it interesting that there are no Jews lined up throwing yarmulkes at the White House or rioting like fools in the street? Do you want to know why that is? It's because they're educated, and they know for a fact that he is not anti-Semitic and he is no one to fear.
They say the left treats black people like children and respond to the accusations of conservative racist tokenization by throwing it back, implying that leftists think black people are too stupid to make their own decisions.
I have a serious question. How much did she pay you to wear that shirt? Oh, he can't make his own decisions because he's black? Didn't say that. Definitely this is.
And that's why they become right-wing, because they're too stupid to think for themselves. But then they do the exact same thing that they accuse the left of doing when they are talking about black Democrats, by implying that black people have been tricked into voting Democrat. Now, all of that being said, I want to stress again that bigotry of low expectations is still harmful. And while its harm gets usually overstated by conservatives, conservatives are right in saying that the left should talk about bigotry of low expectations instead of neglect the subject entirely. But just one small problem with that. We do! The left talks about bigotry of low expectations all the time. The only differences are, 1. We don't usually refer to it as bigotry of low expectations, and 2. We don't talk about it in the way that the right would want us to talk about it. That being, we don't use it as an argument against progressive change. The way we talk about bigotry of low expectations, or as most people on the left refer to it, liberal bigotry, is in the way of implicit bias. A concept that many on the right also reject, by the way. We talk about how white liberals often slow down their speech and adjust their vocabulary when talking to black people, and sometimes compliment a black person's intelligence in a condescending way that they don't do to other white people, and many other examples. So, now that we've established that leftists do talk about bigotry of low expectations, let's talk about another point right-wingers make against the left. And that is the suggestion that telling black people they're oppressed is racist. I've seen this being propagated by conservatives a lot, and it's an example of conservatives playing the language game. A language game is a system of manipulating spoken words to render them incomprehensible to the untrained ear. Language games are used primarily by groups attempting to conceal their conversations from others. It goes something like this. White liberals claim to support black people, yet tell them awful things like that they're oppressed. That's about as good as I could summarize the argument in its purest form. And I gotta say, it does carry a certain vagueness about it that leaves plausible deniability to it. Think about it. From the sound of it, it's unclear whether the person making it truly believes that black people are oppressed or not. They could be saying that black people aren't oppressed, and framing it in a way that assumes that the person they're arguing with already agrees with them. Either that, or even if black people are oppressed, you shouldn't tell them because that might make them sad or something. Either way, it's a brilliant strategy. Now, there's a lot to unpack here. First of all, have these people never heard of the saying, shoot the message, not the messenger? Like, if someone is, let's say, standing on the sidewalk, and they're on their phone, about 50 feet away, someone is stealing their bike. But they don't notice it, because they're on their phone, so someone else runs up to them. But by the time the person in question has been alerted, it's already too late, and the thief has stolen the bike and ran away. Now, as a result, the owner of the bike is now obviously sad that their bike is stolen. Now, does this mean that the person who alerted them is a bad person and shouldn't have alerted them? No, because the owner of the bike would have likely found out anyway, and he can still do something about it. But you know what? I actually have a problem with the whole entire framing of this argument. because it suggests that black people need white people to explain to them they're oppressed, as if they already didn't know that themselves. If anything, it's the other way around. Black people tell white people that they, as black people, are oppressed, which they know from their experiences of their lives, and the injustices that they face. Because if black people are oppressed, who would know better than black people themselves? But let's be honest, most of the people making this argument don't think black people are oppressed. But instead of saying that outwardly, they dress up their argument as in saying it's bad in general, regardless of if they actually are, to tell black people they're oppressed. And that's ultimately to avoid having to actually discuss the existence of systemic racism. Because deep down, they know that that's an argument they'd lose. So is this how these people see the world? So after slavery abruptly ended 400 years ago, black people were all just chilling in their middle-class neighborhoods and not being unfairly targeted by police. All of a sudden, a bunch of white liberals, for no reason, just because it would be funny I guess, started waving their arms around, telling black people they're oppressed. And the black people were just like, wow, I never knew that I was oppressed. Thank you, white savior, for telling that these things that I apparently never experienced are happening to me. I and all the other black people are now gonna lay on the couch and be depressed as a result of obtaining this information. And then all the white people high-five each other, cheering, yay, we did it, we ruined black people. Like, it's ridiculous. And yet there are so many black conservatives running with this narrative, saying stuff like, I am not oppressed. Wow, you've proved the impossible. You personally don't feel oppressed. Thank you for your personal anecdote. But obviously, if an entire group of people are oppressed, then not everybody is going to experience the things that come from that oppression on an equal level. But when it comes to if a group is oppressed or not, I tend to lean towards the data and not personal anecdotes of people saying they're not oppressed. Next one. Calling black people victims is racist. And this one obviously has a lot to do with the whole victim mentality, clean your room, that conservatives always spout. It is a very common trend among the right to treat the word victim as an insult. A lot of that, of course, also has to do with toxic masculinity, like the expectation that you as a man are not supposed to admit that you need help because that's somehow a bad thing. It's all bullshit. But I'm not gonna go into all of that since this video is mainly about race and racism, and not gender. So, are black people victims? Well, yes, they're victims of systemic racism. I don't see what's wrong with saying that. But when the right talks about the left calling black people victims, they leave that entire part out. And I understand most of them don't believe in systemic racism, but they could at the very least present the thing that they're criticizing in its complete version. But they act like the word victim is some slur, which it's not. Everyone is a victim in some respect, but I think they think this because when they hear the word victim, they can't help but imagine a certain person, a character basically, someone who is hurt and down. And it's not very empowering. But that's not a reason to deny the fact that black people are victims to a system that marginalizes them. And that is indeed not very empowering. But then it's the system's fault for not empowering them. And I think speaking out about the injustices committed against your people is actually very empowering, because then you're standing up for yourself. Admitting that you are a victim to a system that oppresses you is not admitting weakness, because it doesn't show any weakness on your part. If anything, it shows weakness on the system's part. But of course, conservatives don't get that. They just say that calling black people victims is a bad thing. But they don't bother to explain how the word victim is bad. When in reality, the word victim is pretty neutral in terms of morality in the way that it relates to the person. And listen, I'm happy to use different words. I personally don't usually refer to anyone as a victim in the general sense. And I don't even think you can be a victim in the general sense. No, it's always specific to something. A common thing for black conservatives to respond with is to list all the great achievements of black people to somehow disprove them being victims.
You see, it was the 30s, the 40s, 50s, and 60s. There was a black community, my community, that led our country in the growth of the middle class. Men matriculated from college. Men committed to marriage, over 70% in the percentage of entrepreneurs. And that entrepreneur base of 40% in our community led to 50 to 60% of black Americans in the 1960s being part of the middle class. So no, don't believe the leftists about how oppressed we've been. We were kicking butt, period. I lived it.
But it really doesn't. Saying that black people are victims to a system that oppresses them isn't saying that they are lazy or can't get anything done. That's on you. Quite the contrary, actually. Because so many black people don't have the same privileges white people do, it's so much more impressive when they do succeed. Like, have these people never heard of Pan-Africanism? Like, if a white person and a black person go to the same college, on average, that black person probably worked harder to get into that college. So when you say that black people were kicking butt, I completely believe you, because in many ways, they still are. What a lot of this comes down to is disagreement on what the word victim means. Conservatives just have a different definition of the word victim than everyone else, a categorically wrong one. Now, about the whole victim mentality thing, a lot of people on the right seem to misunderstand what we mean. We're not saying that because black people are victims of racism, that they will never make it and never succeed. And that's not true. We're simply saying that it's harder for black people than for others. How hard, of course, depends on person to person. And of course, there are plenty of successful black people. And even if the vast majority of black people went on to become incredibly successful entrepreneurs, even more successful than most white people, that won't change the fact that they had to work harder on average than white people. And the simple truth is that if they had to work harder, then we don't live in a completely equal society. And we should strive to change that. And are there some black people that think that because they are systemically discriminated against, that they will never make it? Sure. But that's statistically inevitable. And there will always be people like that in any group. And I haven't really seen any evidence that that kind of attitude is more common in black people. And even if a black person does feel like that, do you really think they feel like that because someone told them they were oppressed? No, it was probably from their own experiences, like growing up in an impoverished neighborhood. The reality is, most black people aren't sitting around feeling sorry for themselves. They're working hard to make it out of their shitty situation. And while it's true that black people today are doing much better than black people 50 years ago, during the times of Jim Crow, there were probably also people saying the exact same thing. Were the black people on the plantations hundreds of years ago victims? Or is that also bigotry of low expectations? Maybe the Union soldiers just thought that black people were too stupid to pick cotton. Like, that's ridiculous. But with such essentialist thinking, how do you even condemn such logic? Here are my closing thoughts. The fundamental problem with statements like the Democrats are the real racists, or the left are the real racists, or the progressives are the real racists, is that it's an implicit defense of the Republicans, or the right, or the conservatives. It lies in the real part. If the criticism was simply the Democrats are racist, or better yet, there is racism in the Democratic Party, I could totally accept that. But if you are just bringing it up to make white conservatives look better, then that shows me that you're not really all that interested in fighting racism as you led on. So, to answer the question, who are the real racists? I guess the real racists were the friends we made along the way. Thanks everybody for watching. Till next time, Childish.